It's really great to be here today to talk on another topic that's been quite interesting and often in the news of late, and that is Iran, for a very long time known as Persia. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that background today. And it's really great to be here again with Erin, and we have a special guest with us today, Erin, as well.
Yes, thanks very much, Neil. And a little teaser there that we've got a guest with us. But it's been a really interesting week in the international politics space. Like, there is no shortage of things for us to be talking about. We've got Trump blackmailing European allies in pursuit of his Greenland agenda. You've got BRICS doing maritime exercises off the coast of South Africa. But the real story that we wanted to drill down into is what is happening in Iran. And I think that we landed on this because, many of us are a little bit confused. Obviously, there's been, the internet blackout. There's been a lack of media reporting. There's been a bunch of things happen, but I reckon some of our listeners will be interested to get a little bit more of the facts, hopefully, a little bit of the history of Iran as well, and then we can and go to our guest because, as someone who works in international politics, I think the most important thing is understanding that you don't know everything about international politics.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, so very, very exciting to have my dear friend, Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert with us today. But before we bring Kylie into the chat, Neil, let's talk about Iran. Tell us a little bit more about the details, where this country is, what size it is, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. So Iran is a very interesting country, obviously located in the Middle East. It's actually the second largest country in the Middle East. It's also the 17th largest country globally. So geographically, quite a large country, and it has had an impact on a whole heap of historical events. In another podcast, we're surely going to dive into our connection to India. And one of the most interesting things that I discovered over India is it has a very big population of Zoroastrians, which are originally from what is now modern day Iran. But I did also do some research beforehand for some curious facts and figures about Iran. And Iran, interestingly enough, once arrested 14 spy squirrels in 2007. So there were squirrels outside a nuclear enrichment facility, and the Iranian army thought that they were American spies wearing small recording devices that could be used for eavesdropping. And so Iran is one of the few countries in the world that has actually arrested squirrels for espionage. So that's my sort of introductory fact of the day as we dive into Iran. Did you know that, Erin? Were you up on
No, I had
squirrel
no idea, and
arrest?
I'm more curious to know if Kylie knew that one as well. But no, I hadn't heard that. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the monkeys in Bali. The ones that come up and sort of steal
Steal
your
your
wallet and steal
bag.
your food and all that stuff. Yeah, exactly. But look, we do have Kylie with us today. She is a research fellow in security studies at Macquarie University and also a former prisoner in Iran. And if any of you have not had a chance to read her book, shameless plug, fantastic read, particularly on Audible because Kylie reads it herself. And that is how I listen to it. So we have Kylie with us today. Thanks so much, Kylie, for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Please help us unpack what's going on in Iran. It's been really like my own experience of trying to understand the situation. I'm looking through social media, and I think I've said to you separately, I can't tell what's real. I can't tell what's fiction. I can't tell what's propaganda. It's really difficult. So from your perspective, someone's obviously very deep in this, what is going on? What's happening in Iran right now?
It's actually really difficult to know exactly what is happening right now because there's been an internet blackout for more than a week at this point. And what has trickled out, and it's only a tiny fraction of probably the stories that will come out in a big deluge once it finally is restored, is really, really shocking and alarming. All indications point to a horrific massacre having occurred, I think mostly between the dates of 8th and 9th of January. But we're not, 100% sure because of that blackout. Communication lines, so, mobile phone coverage, landlines, internet access, everything was cut. And this was perpetrated under the cover of darkness, essentially. Even Starlink has been jammed by military jamming devices, reportedly as well. So it's actually really difficult to know. You're getting all kinds of figures thrown around. The latest that I've seen has been about 16,500 people killed. That was reported by, I think, CBS News out of the US. But we don't know. It could be much higher. It could be well into 20,000 people. I've also seen reports of more than 300,000 people injured, mostly through live fire, through military-grade weapons, and, live bullets being fired at peaceful, unarmed protesters in the streets, essentially. So yeah, what we've seen, the footage, the videos, the clips, the witness testimony that's come out of Iran, I mean, this tiny trickle via Starlink has been utterly shocking. This looks like one of the worst massacres that's ever occurred in the modern Middle East, comparable perhaps to the Hama massacre in Syria of the 1980s. So yeah, it's really shocking stuff. And unfortunately, I don't think enough attention has been focused on this issue, either via the media or in international fora as well.
Yeah, whereas I think someone like me, I'm well and truly in that algorithm, right? So I'm getting it pushed through to an extent, but it's like, how do you actually verify any of this information? And then therefore, I'm really sort of hesitant to share it. Like I'll share things that, I think I shared one from Yalda Hakim the other day, and where I can sort of verify the journalist, and I know that, what they're saying is probably, not too far from the truth. But what I've also found interesting this weekend is that the Supreme Leader of Iran came out and said, yeah, like lots of people have died, thousands of people have died, and this is the US's fault. What do you sort of make of that accusation?
There's a lot of misinformation, particularly in the post-October 7 online social media space. But yes, this is the playbook of the Islamic Republic going all the way back to the 1979 revolution and onwards. It's always been a US hand or an Israeli hand or even a British hand behind the scenes, puppeteering, controlling everything. These protesters, by most accounts numbering, into the dozens, if not hundreds of thousands, are all, doing the bidding of a foreign entity and are not taking to the streets because of some organic grassroots uprising motivated by domestic grievances, heaven forbid. So, I mean, that narrative doesn't have much credence. I think irrespective of Trump's tweets, they would have said that. That's always been the playbook. There's always a foreign hand behind the scenes. But Trump obviously poured fuel on the fire through a number of Truth Social posts and kind of interviews or sort of answering questions flung at him by journalists, some on the White House lawn on this issue, where he just kind of freelanced and, said quite a few correct things, like, yes, Ayatollah Khamenei is a very sick man, quote unquote, to say what Trump said, but also promising assistance, saying we're locked and loaded, we're ready
Help's
to
on
go.
its way. Yeah.
Help's on its way.
Yeah.
And then no help was forthcoming. I mean, he actually encouraged the protesters to take over institutions, to take to the streets, to keep fighting, giving the impression that the United States was going to intervene on their side. And they did nothing. So that's also a shocking and shameful, betrayal of those poor, unarmed, innocent people, as well as sort of makes a mockery of the US deterrence factor and sort of brings to mind Obama's red lines over Syrian chemical weapons, for example, which turned out to be a blunder and a foreign policy disaster for him. So, I do think it's significant, but, the Iranian regime was going to claim that there was an American hand behind this, no matter what Trump did or said.
And Kylie, it would be really interesting as well, just to give people a little bit of your background and story. So, you have an amazing book out over sort of some of the history of Iran, but what got you interested in Iran and what, how did you end up imprisoned in Iran? What's a little bit about your personal connection and story?
My academic expertise is mainly the Arab states. So I wrote my PhD on the Arab Gulf states, not Iran. But obviously Iran is the northern neighbor in the Persian Gulf, and you can't write about the Gulf without touching on Iran as well. But I was invited to an academic conference in Iran in 2018 by an Iranian university, and I got my visa in advance and everything was approved and cleared. And I went for what I thought would be 2.5 weeks, and unfortunately got detained at the airport while attempting to leave the country by the Revolutionary Guard, and was thrown in prison, given a 10-year prison sentence for espionage. And I served more than 2 years, 2 years and 3 months of that sentence in 2 different Iranian prisons before being freed in a prisoner swap deal negotiated by the Australian government. So as a result, I've sort of obviously developed more of an interest in Iran following all of that. And, I learned Farsi in prison, and I met many amazing Iranian people, and, and got to know quite a few Revolutionary Guard as well. And I guess from that personal experience has developed an academic interest in the subject as well.
Can you, Kylie, so we sort of talk about Iran and we talk about the IRGC. Can you, for someone unfamiliar, can you sort of explain, who they are and what the dynamics are in Iran when it comes to particularly the IRGC? Because I think they're kind of like a state within a state, right?
Yeah, they are the classic state within a state. This is a classic kind of divide and conquer strategy masterminded by Ayatollah Khomeini, the precursor, the guy who did the revolution in 79, and then continued by Khamenei, the current supreme leader, whereby you have multiple competing factions that are constantly jostling with one another, and you preside over the lot from above and play each faction off against each other to maintain power. And so this is what happened. The IRGC was set up as a rival military force to the actual Iranian army, which had to go through an ideological restructuring following the revolution anyway, and purges of generals that were loyal to the Shah and, etc. So they set up this parallel structure, which was tasked with ensuring the aims and the goals of the Islamic Revolution, specifically the Islamic Revolution, would be maintained. And they are loyal only to the supreme leader. They answer directly to him. They don't answer to the civilian government or the Majlis, the parliament of Iran. And, they're brutal. They are ideologically extremely hardline Shia Islamist in worldview, virulently anti-Semitic, but also, anti-Sunni, I would say as well, based on a lot of my conversations with them. They are responsible for most of the terror financing that's been happening for couple of decades or more now, again, spearheaded by Iran in other parts of the Middle East. So all of those terror proxies, the so-called axis of resistance that Iran had built up prior to October 7 and still maintains, but in a much more weaker state today, that's all been the IRGC's doing. They also have a rival intelligence organization to the actual Ministry of Intelligence in Iran. And so I was arrested by IRGC intelligence, not by the Iranian government intelligence organization. So it's like having two CIAs and two national militaries and two of, they have extensive economic interests too. They function like a mafia gang in many ways as well. And so they have rival economic and business interests to a lot of Iranian companies and state-owned enterprises, including in the oil sector as well. So they've got their tentacles in every aspect of the Iranian society, politics, economy.
So when we talk about bringing down the government in Iran now, all these protesters, like what is the end game? Is it the IRGC or is it the government of the day? Who is their primary target, if not both? What is that dynamic?
It's everyone and everything associated with this regime. Yeah. It's got to that point, right? We saw the first mass protest movement in Iran in 2009, there's the so-called Green Movement, which was triggered by a stolen election. And this is an authoritarian election. So a stolen authoritarian election with, where only two closely vetted and loyal to the regime candidates were allowed to run at all, were allowed to stand in that final presidential election. And still the system was rigged in favor of one of them, the more hardline one, Ahmadinejad. And that was, in a way, the last attempt to reform the regime from within, where people took to the streets, not because they wanted to overthrow the whole structure itself, although I'm sure some of them did, but others were just angry that their vote was stolen. Their vote within the confines of that regime and the way that it operated. Since that movement, every subsequent uprising has been about removing this regime altogether, not about reforming it from within. It's beyond reform. I think it's largely accepted inside and outside the country that these guys are unreformable, and you need to have wholesale renewal and reconstruction. So IRGC is much loathed and hated. So is the Besiege, which is the popular mobilization militia force that's affiliated with the IRGC, but made up of civilian volunteers who are very ideological, very committed, brainwashed people who have also been in the streets shooting protesters recently. They want to remove all of it. And the guy at the top, the supreme leader, who's, again, presiding over all of this and is responsible for these atrocities ultimately.
And so what is it going to take to bring them down? That's a really big question to be asked.
I know. Look, this is, prior to this massacre, this bloodbath, because there's no other word for it, many people, including myself, would have said sustained popular mobilization against the regime could have brought them down. Nobody anticipated that they would be this bloodthirsty, that this is, Bashar al-Assad in 2011 level, I'm going to kill my way out of these protests, and I'm going to force my re-control of this, no matter how many hundreds of thousands I kill. I mean, that was the attitude of Assad. And many pointed out that the IRGC was very active on the ground supporting Assad at that time and probably helped him write the playbook. So now they're implementing it at home. And I think most people just didn't expect that they would be as violent as they have been. In subsequent protests, they used tear gas, rubber bullets, shotgun pellets, and they killed a lot of people, arrested, executed protesters, but not at the scale that we have seen. 500 people were killed odd in the months-long protests of 2022, the Women Life Freedom Uprising.
Yeah.
They've potentially killed, 20,000 people in just a few short days.
For those who might be listening and aren't as familiar with sort of some of the history of Iran, and it's a very complex kind of history that goes back to sort of pre the Common Era, what's your sort of reflections in sort of a potted history of a couple of minutes as to sort of how Iran got here today? So obviously there was the Arab conquest of Iran sort of around the 7th century, if I remember correctly. And then sort of we've had a Shah that you've referred to a little bit, and then the revolution in 79. Sort of in a couple of minutes, how would you sort of paint the history of Iran historically and how they got to today?
In a couple of minutes, huh? That's a tough one. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years.
This is your 30-second thesis of Iran's history.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, obviously there's the ancient Persian Empire, and most Iranians today, particularly Persian Iranians, trace their lineage back to, Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, the incredible achievements of that empire and the civilization that it built and developed, and they're very proud of that. And, they would say that Iran is that old. Iran is thousands of years old as a political entity.
What percentage of the population would refer to themselves as sort of originally Persian? Like, is it the majority or the minority, or how does that sort of work on the ground?
It's actually slightly less than 50% are ethnically Persian. I think it's 48, 49, depending on the parameters. Now, that's really interesting because it's been dominated by that Persian political elite since medieval times onwards, really. Although, the Safavids who re-established Iran and actually made it a Shia country rather than a Sunni country, and that's the medieval dynasty that ruled Iran until the 1700s. They, some of them were originally Turkic in origin, not Persian. But there's a lot of mixing, certainly. I mean, these lines are not clear cut. For example, the Kurds, there are Sunni and Shia Kurds. The grandfather of the current crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, who's been agitating of late, Reza Shah, he forcibly moved a whole lot of Kurds from the Sunni periphery into, the eastern part of the country, and many of them became Shia and not Sunni. And so there's been efforts to sort of not ethnically cleanse, but ethnically mix by force, I guess, parts of the country. So it's not a clear-cut picture, but there are huge ethnic and religious minority groups in Iran, and many of them have not been on board with a centralized state, which has been, a source of conflict throughout history too.
And another dynamic to quiz you on, Kylie, the reason we met was through someone I went to school with, actually, after you came back from Iran. Our dear friend Ian gets a shout out. But we went to school with someone who was Iranian Baha'i refugee, and a friend of mine wrote a PhD, a really interesting PhD on the experience of the Baha'i Iranian refugees in Australia. So what's also that kind of element to the ethnic and religious history of Iran?
Yeah, well, the Baha'i religion is a relatively new religion, and it emerged out of sort of an esoteric form of Shia Islam, I believe, but it is not at all a Muslim sect. It's sort of post-Islamic in many ways. And for that reason, they have been persecuted throughout their history by, Iranian clerics. And then after the revolution, the regime and the government itself basically outlawed the Baha'i religion and cracked down in a very vicious way on them and their religious practice, in part because apostasy is banned in Islam. So Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. There are no prophets after him. And, the Baha'i believe they have, I think his name is Baha'u'llah, although I might be getting that wrong. So I've sincere apologies if I'm getting that wrong, dear Baha'i listeners. But, they have broken away from that and added to it, which is apostasy, according to traditional Muslims, and therefore punishable by death in Sharia law. So this is, and we've seen this with other sects in the Middle East, like, the Yazidis, what happened to them in Iraq. I mean, ISIS justified that genocide of Yazidis under the exact same terms as the persecution of the Baha'i in Iran.
And the Baha'i religion, their headquarters is in Haifa in Israel. Kylie, what's your sort of thoughts and reflections as to sort of why it's there and the basis of the religion in another conflict zone in the Middle East?
So I'm not an expert in Baha'i, but from what I understand, Baha'u'llah, one of the founders of the Baha'i faith, due to the persecution he suffered prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, I think in the 19th century it must have been, his burial site's actually in Akko in Israel, which is very close to Haifa, just on the other side of the Bay of Haifa there. And so they've established their world headquarters, probably due to the persecution they suffered in Iran, in what would have been Ottoman-controlled Palestine at the time. And by coincidence, then that area came under the control of Israel in 1948 after Israel was established. And then from 1979 onwards, you've got this sort of virulently anti-Israel regime cropping up in Iran. And by happenstance, the headquarters of the Baha'i faith is in Israel today, which does not lend much assistance to their claims that, they are an organic religious movement, not puppeteered by foreign powers like Israel. So I think it makes it harder for them. But I just want to stress I'm not an expert in the Baha'i faith at all. My knowledge of them is quite rudimentary. There are a number of wonderful Baha'i citizens here in Australia that I've met and talked with and spoken about Iran with, but I cannot at all claim to speak for them or their beliefs.
Well, let me jump to another sort of question here, because I think that, for a lot of people, they're going, well, what does this mean for Australia, for example? And I think the way the politics of this plays out in Australia is quite interesting. And I quote from an AFR article last week that the progressive left must stop making excuses for Iran's tyrants. So what are your observations about how, the awareness or the protest to this horrible conflict at the moment in Iran, or these protests in Iran, how is that all playing out politically in Australia?
It really upsets me to think that there has been some distinction drawn here, because viewing the little that we have seen of this massacre, it really truly is horrific. And the kinds of people who've been killed, many of them have been under 18 or aged in their 20s. These are young people being butchered in the streets for protesting for their right. These are ordinary people. They are not Mossad agents. They are not controlled by foreign regimes. These are just people who want what we have here, which is human rights and democracy and freedom of speech and the ability to live a good life. And there are some elements on the extreme far left that I've seen online in particular, who they don't have any sympathy for that, because my enemy's enemy is my friend, and they have cleaved so tightly to the Palestinian cause. They see the Islamic Republic in Iran as a supporter of Hamas and of those extreme elements within Palestine, within Gaza. And therefore, those protesters on the street seeking the overthrow of that great patron of Hamas must be the enemy as well. And they buy into the propaganda of the regime, saying Israel is supporting these protesters, and these guys on the far left don't like Israel, therefore they don't like the protesters, and they don't have sympathy for those children and young people who've been brutally massacred for no reason whatsoever other than wanting freedom and democracy. So that's obviously in stark opposition to what people on the left ostensibly believe, which is in freedom and democracy. It's in supporting oppressed peoples to overthrow their oppressors. Why does this paradigm suddenly become problematic in the case of Iran? It shouldn't. And I think it's fueled by misinformation online in particular. I think there's a concerted influence campaign happening on social media to try and push the Iranian narrative here, actually. But it's a real shame. And I would like to see the same level of support given to Iran that was given to the Gazan civilian population suffering under bombardment.
So, Neil, you're a Labor man, and we've seen the Prime Minister and, say, Premier Chris Minns come out and make some pretty strong statements on Iran. What, do you have any observations about, the left's response to Iran beyond the political class and the political elites in Australia?
So I think what we're just seeing in Australia is actually a bit of a schism, and some of the recent polling that we've seen, either the News poll or the Resolve poll that have come out today, that shows there's a left in Australia, or a centre left, of which I'd like to be part of. And then we're actually seeing a more extreme left being developed in that space as well. So if you have a look at some of the responses and feedback, particularly in relation to things like the Bondi massacre in Australia, in the Resolve and the News polling that's come out, the vast majority of Australians seem to be saying, hey, more needed to be done. The vast majority of Australians, and we're talking a 2-to-1 ratio across a lot of those pollings. So I think what's happening is we're seeing a very vocal minority in the far left in these sorts of instances, and perhaps the centre is still holding. And, our aspirations and one of the reasons why we kicked off this podcast, obviously, together, is to show that there can be a difference between the centre left and the centre right, but that there's broader extremes that we also need to be aware of. And I think it's really worrying. If you look at the numbers Kylie's spoken about today, whether it's 12,000, 16,000, 20,000 dead in a couple of days and up to 300,000 injured, that's multiples of some of the numbers that we've seen in other global conflicts in a very concentrated period of time. And I think we do need to get better at articulating that any conflict, any massacre, any genocide should be treated with the equal standard. And I think some of the double standards coming through are causing more schisms in Australia. But I do see the hope that, the polling that has come out is showing that the vast majority of Australians are sticking to the centre. But I share Kylie's view that it's really disappointing that we're not seeing more profile and discussion over what's happening in Iran and some of the history that's really rich and that has made contributions to Australia not being reflected in social media, our news and our political discourse as well.
Yeah, and I remember, Kylie, it would have been just before you went to Iran. In fact, you went in, I think, 2018, is that right? Only a couple of years before that, when I was running some programs for students in India. And I remember sending out a newsletter. Well, Iran is one of the new destinations for people to be going to. It felt like there was sort of this era, if I had had the same invitation that you had, I probably would have gone to. It was whereas now at the moment we're sort of in this period where Iran is sort of, it's closing off again, and I think we all need to be really worried about that. Some of the feedback we're given on this podcast is that we need to be less agreeable and we need to fight more, but I think that this is the kind of nuance that we're really sort of looking for, Neil, which is really great. So, Kylie, thank you so much for coming and chatting to us. I know I'm going to be going away and thinking about this a lot more, but also really closely watching what lies ahead in the next few days and months, in particular for Iran. But given this podcast is about the pub test, which just seems like oddly too much humour for the current crisis in Iran, what do you think, Neil? Does the pub test pass the pub test when we're talking about something so serious?
I know it's a really hard one given the sort of the seriousness of the topic here, but I think, on all measures, whether you reflect on Kylie's discussion over Trump and sort of his response or lack thereof, that definitely doesn't pass the pub test. I think, the fact that we've seen largely in Australia a huge amount of silence towards what's happening in Iran, does that pass the pub test? Through to sort of
No.
Elon Musk, not even, and what we do with Starlink and other bits and pieces in those countries. I think sort of across the board, there's a general disappointment that this probably hasn't passed the pub test by any major standard, whether internationally, domestically, or even across sort of the social media, left or right, in the Australian landscape.
Yeah. And you can sort of go one step further when you think about, the current situation with President Trump and Greenland. It's like, how can you have any legitimacy in this crisis when you are, slapping 10, 25% tariffs on your European allies until they sell you Greenland? Like the whole entire geopolitical economic environment does not pass the pub test at the moment. Kylie, are we allowed to ask you?
Oh, I mean, it's funny that this is the test when pubs are actually illegal in Iran and drinking's banned in Iran. Although I'd say that there's a huge amount of alcohol consumed, on a daily basis in that country, despite that prohibition. I would add the United Nations to this too, where is the UN Secretary General? Why has there been no emergency session? Where's the UN Human Rights Council? They have not held a session on Iran. Notoriously they're populated with all kinds of nasty regimes full of, their own human rights abusing situations as well. So how many emergency sessions and how many General Assembly resolutions and debates and things have we seen on Gaza? Why are there crickets when it comes to Iran? I think there's a real double standard there. There's a lack of interest if it's not a Western country oppressing somebody, if it's the Muslims oppressing other Muslims, as we've seen with Sudan as well. Then somehow that's expected, the tyranny of low expectations or whatever, and we're just going to carry on as per usual. For me, that doesn't pass the pub test, and the Iranian people deserve better.
This podcast is proudly brought to you by Baker & York and Tank.